Welcome, psychology students. This is Stovall, picking up in chapter 1 as we talk about the science of psychology. We looked into, just briefly, the evolution of the concept of the non-material essence of man, oftentimes referred to as the soul. Now, early philosophers argued and discussed the soul. Now, psychologists begin to pursue the mind. So the functioning of the brain is the mind. And psychologists have a general consensus to address the idea of the mind and body interaction, to do it scientifically. Science involves observation and examination or scientific study. And so to do this in a laboratory was the idea of psychologists. So the first person to attempt studying the mind, figuring out what the mind is, how does it work, how does it interact with the body, to do that in a lab was Wilhelm Wundt. His first laboratory was in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. He developed the scientific concept of structuralism, proposed that the human mind is compartmentalized into three structures: experience, emotion, and thought. He said that the mind is based on these elements. So his attempt to theorize this and discover this was identified as objective introspection. He would simply bring subjects into his lab, put an object on the table, and ask a person to share their experience or their thought or their emotion. This idea of structuralism, the mind as structures, was adapted by Edward Tishner and brought to America. He's actually credited with the name structuralism, but he added to this inquiry not just what does the object feel like, what does it look like, but he added what thoughts does this object bring about. So here we have a flower. Subjects perhaps would see the flower, they would describe its smell and its touch, and then he would ask, tell me about things that are yellow. Now, the problem with objective introspection was that it lent itself to subjectivity. 1,000 different people, 1,000 different descriptives, and it really doesn't tell us much about what the mind is and how the mind works. I oftentimes ask my students, if I ask you to describe a memory, and if I ask you to break this memory down according to how do you think about the memory, how do you feel about the memory, and what was the experience like, you may have a difficult time separating thoughts and feelings and emotions. And so that was the problem. Margaret Washburn was the first woman to receive a PhD in psychology in 1894. She authored the book, The Animal Mind, and she is noteworthy in that respect. William James is oftentimes referred to as the father of American psychology because he challenged structuralism, and he challenged it because he said that in terms of structures, that the mind actually works more like a stream. Our consciousness is blend. You can't really tell where your thoughts stop and your emotions begin. And so he really focused on functionalism in the sense that if we improve our functioning over time, and if we adapt, we have demonstrated that our minds is uniquely human. It adapts. If you look at the way that kids play, the subject of a playground, playgrounds that I grew up on playing on are a whole lot different than the ADA accessible, wheelchair accessible playground equipment. It's you could see there's very positive adaptations just in that world, not to mention technologies and cell phone. And so because humans adapt, William James argued that this is the better focus. The Gestalt psychologist laid the groundwork for something that we would call cognitive psychology. And they were interested in how the mind perceives sensory stimuli. So the Gestaltists say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Specifically, the word in German Gestalt means good form, and they believe that in our sensory perception, we're looking to complete incomplete, looking at wholes and not just individual points of data. So today, cognitive psychology is the field. The Gestalt really laid a lot of the groundwork for this. Cognitive psychology, cognition is the psychological study of thought, would include things such as learning, problem solving, creativity, language, and we will study that in greater detail. Sigmund Freud was a neurologist in the late 18th century in Vienna, and he created psychoanalysis, which is an insight therapy for fear and anxiety. He believed that phobias were repressed conflicts. You get anxious about something and you basically repress this and keep it out of the conscious mind. His theory focuses on the unconscious and early childhood experiences. Now, if you want to limit your scientific inquiry to things that you can observe and measure, then you have to throw out Freudian psychoanalysis, because you cannot measure unconscious experiences or the impact of early childhood experiences on the unconscious mind. So as I've said in my classes on many occasions, my belief in a soul is not too different from the Freudian concept of the unconscious mind, in that neither can be measured, neither can be observed, neither can be essentially proven. However, Freudian psychoanalytic theory, as we will refer to it, became the very dominant voice in psychology for hundreds of years. And there was pushback to this, specifically from a guy named John Watson, who believed that psychology was losing its moorings. It was setting adrift because it was not focused on observable, measurable behavior. And he almost equated it to something that was quasi-religious, Freud being the pope of the psyche. Now, psyche is a Greek word for soul, psycho, logos, the study of the soul. However, psychologists don't believe in the soul, therefore that oftentimes in the psychology textbook, they're replacing soul and mind, kind of equating it. But they're really two different constructs, two different ideas. When I talk about soul, most of my students think belief, faith, conscience, and all of those things, whether you're talking about a traditional Judeo-Christian idea of the soul, Western concept of the soul, or you're talking about the Freudian psyche, Watson would say neither of them are measurable. So he actually drew his inspiration from a Russian physiologist. So if you're taking human A&P, anatomy is what the body is, physiology is what the body does, and Pavlov studied what the body does. Things like reflex actions, blinking, swallowing, elimination of wastes, falling asleep. These things thought to be completely autonomic, which means that they couldn't be learned. They weren't interacting with the outside environment. But Pavlov created a theory of classical conditioning in which he demonstrated in a laboratory with dogs that animals did interact with the environment in terms of their automatic reflexes. So, for instance, salivation is a reflexive action. Dogs do it automatically. They see food, they begin salivating. Except one day Pavlov walked in where he was studying the digestive processes of dogs. He walks into the door of his lab and the dog starts salivating. He had no food with him. Very similar to how your pet responds when you walk in the door. They begin to respond physiologically. And he decided that a study was in order. He didn't realize he was actually creating a psychological psychology study, what would become the really basis of the new thrust of psychology. I would say that Freud didn't go away, but Watson came in as a competing view, and actually another dominant voice entered the field. And so Pavlov would lay the groundwork for John Watson. And so Pavlov studied that the dogs would salivate when he walked in the door and when food was presented. So he took a neutral stimulus that does not evoke any physiological response, something neutral like a metronome or a bell, and he rang the bell, no salivation from the dogs, but he would ring the bell and then present food. Ring the bell and present food. And he would do this over and over and over and over for several weeks until he would ring the bell and the dogs began salivating. And so he basically referred to this as stimulus substitution, that the area in the brain triggered by food in dogs. He now substituted that for something that does not produce the sound of, it's a non-native sound. And so this idea of classical conditioning would later become what we now know as learning psychology. And John Watson replicated this experiment with and adapted the experiment to a baby. So baby Albert was a young toddler, and there is actually silent video footage of this research study in which Watson would present a small furry animal that did not scare the child. On several occasions, the small animal, small rabbit was around, and nothing scary. But then a white rat, which the child was not afraid of, was in the child's presence. And Watson paired this with a loud noise, scared the child, and from that point on, the child was scared of any small furry animal. And so this idea of classical conditioning led to what we today call conditioned emotional responses. You know them as phobias or fears. So Watson believed that fears were learned through process of conditioning. And this went to odds with Freud, who believed that fears were repressed, psychological experiences that were housed in the subconscious mind. So today, some areas that we will need to be familiar with through the class. The psychodynamic school of thought is the new psychoanalytic. It's the Freudian descendants of Freudian thought, still existing today. Behaviorism is, there's been lots of work in behaviorism. So Freud emphasized a lot of sexual activity or sexual desires that are stored in the subconscious mind. And there's, some would say, a de-emphasis of this. A guy named B.F. Skinner, who you see here, focuses on operant conditioning, which is really reward and punishment, and deals more with voluntary behavior and less on the automatic reflexes of classical conditioning. The two are really key players in the field. The humanistic perspective, Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow were big players here. And this school of thought argued against the psychoanalytic negativity or the behavioral determinism, which basically says everything, all of your behavior is dictated by the environment. The humanists focus on one's own agency in determining their own identity. person's own destiny to choose their own label, if you will. The biopsychological view focuses on the biological events. So now we have elaborate technologies that let us look inside the living brain. So it's a very exciting time to study psychology. And this attributes human and animal behavior to biological events, kind of behind the scenes. The cognitive schools we've mentioned, memory, intelligence, perception, and learning. Intelligence tests are really a big component of this field we will discuss. My students don't like any kind of test, really, any standardized test, especially IQ test. The sociocultural school is the relationship between social behavior and culture. And the evolutionary school of psychology focuses on the mental traits shared by all humans, how this has changed over time. I really want you to differentiate between a psychiatrist and a psychologist. All four of these folks could do therapy with clients and patients. However, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They've gone to med school. They have just done their residency in psychiatry. So they can conduct therapy, but they can also prescribe psychological medications. I'm going to transition here to the second part of this presentation. And now I want us to look at how psychologists get their information. Hopefully you're familiar with the 8 steps of the scientific method. Let's say that I'm interested in finding out whether or not viewing televised or video game violence affects violent behavior in boys. This would be a scientific question. I first would perceive this scientific question, then I would hypothesize it. So I place the question in a measurable format. So if I compare young boys who play violent video games as opposed to those who don't, I will expect to see an increased display of violent behavior at school. I would test that by comparing these two groups. I would draw conclusions, then I would report, revise, and replicate. Perhaps it shows that there's no significant difference in my population of boys playing violent video games, except for those from disrupted family environments where there is violence and drugs in the home. And if that's the case, then I would want to report that. I'd want to revise the study and target violent versus non-violent video games in homes of where there's family disruption, and maybe look for other variables that could be impacting this behavior. Now, there's lots of models for observing and describing behavior. Here's Jane Goodall observing naturalistic observations. He's observing primates in their natural environment. Perhaps her presence in this environment affects the subject's behavior. And if that's the case, then these observer or experimenter effects need to be mitigated somehow. Looking at laboratory observation is far better in the sense that we can control all variables. So it gives us that advantage. The disadvantage is that we're not observing a person or animal in its natural habitat and likely will act differently. Also, case studies give us the advantage of studying things that we could not study otherwise. The skull that you see here is of Phineas Gage. In the 1800s, he was a railroad worker. There was an explosion, and a large pipe was exploded through his left cheek and out through his prefrontal cortex. And he survived, but had a significant personality and behavioral change. So the advantage is that there's no study that can ethically remove a portion of a person's brain through a violent explosion. So we can't replicate that. And also, we don't know if every person who goes through a violent brain injury in the frontal cortex of the brain is going to respond the same. In terms of surveys, again, the advantage is that we can interview and we can collect data from people all over the country. We can mail them out. We can use surveys over the internet, over the telephone. Face-to-face surveys are usually seen as the best, especially if the interview questions are open-ended. However, the downside is if a person's face-to-face with someone they don't know, they could lie. In other cases, people may not see their own situation accurately. Sometimes we are in denial, or we're truly not seeing ourselves in the right light. We can perhaps have some kind of distorted view of reality. Another way of finding information is the correlation. Correlational study examines the relationship between two variables. So for instance, there's a tremendously high correlation between grade point average and ACT. Now there are students who do great on the ACT and don't do too well in school, and vice versa. But generally, when you see high performing students in the classroom, they're also going to perform well in the ACT. And oftentimes those students will do well in college, but not always. A correlation cannot tell us all the variables that we need to know, and it certainly cannot connect cause and effect relationships, which is what we're looking for in psychology. But I think of a correlational study as a metal detector. The metal detector simply shows us where there is a relationship. It doesn't tell us what is the causative factor. You have positive and negative correlations, and then you have studies that show no correlation, which is sometimes just as important because it tells us no need to investigate that any further. Now, if we're going to study what might be seen as an abstract concept, such as anger or fear, hatred, any of these abstract concepts, we could study them in psychology so as long as we are operationalizing them, which means we put them in a measurable form. In our study, we have to outline the independent and the dependent variable. So if I'm studying the effect of playing video games on memory, I would designate two groups in randomized sampling. That's really important. A random sample means everybody in the population has an equal chance of getting selected for the study. So the random assignment basically sets me up to minimize what we say are confounding variables, extraneous variables. The experimental group is the group that's getting the experimental condition or the independent variable. So if I'm studying the effect of playing video games on memory, those in the experimental group are the ones who are going to play video games. I would have a gaming group and a non-gaming group, people who are gamers and people who are not. And the control group would be let's say the tests of memory that I'm going to give to everybody. So I have 1,000 college students, and let's say I have 500 that are gamers, 500 that are not. I'm simply going to give the tests of memory. Perhaps I want to find out after playing video games, is memory effective? Is it more effective? Is it less effective? Or is it neutral? All right, no relationship. So I'm simply comparing those people who play video games to those who don't. The independent variable or the experimental condition is basically the experimental group. All right, so the control group are those who are not gaming. And I'm going to give them a memory test, and I'm going to compare the results. So a population is the group of people that I'm generalizing to, the group of people I want to study. I can't possibly study everybody in the population, but what I'm looking for is a representative sample. So if my kid loves Dr. Pepper, and let's say my child is 5, and I go to Sonic and I get a Route 44, just a 44-ounce drink, and I fill it with Dr. Pepper, and I give it to my 5-year-old. My 5-year-old cannot handle all of that data. My 5-year-old cannot handle all that Dr. Pepper, and as a researcher, I couldn't possibly survey all 7 billion people in the world, nor would that be effective. That'd be too much data for me to make sense of. But if I'm studying people from Mississippi, and I'm studying their behavior on a specific issue, I would need to know that my sample is from people from Mississippi, and that the demographics are similar in my sample to that of the state. I want to talk about my video game analogy. Let's say that of my 500 gamers, perhaps by knowing they're going to be a part of a research study to see if gaming is going to help their memory, perhaps that knowledge will skew the results. So let's say I want to make sure that my students don't know whether or not they're being studied or not. Well, they're going to consent to the research study, but let's say that they don't know whether or not they are receiving the independent variable or whether they're in the control group. In that case, it is a single blind study. So for your notes and for my test, I usually ask the question that, or acknowledge that the single blind research study controls for the placebo effect. So a single blind study controls for the placebo effect. In terms of a double blind study, now maybe I really have an issue with video games, and so I'm kind of biased against them. Well, I don't want that opinion to skew the results, because it could be that maybe video gaming helps memory. Maybe people who play video games have a better short-term memory, or so I want to be neutral. So if I'm creating my research, my research model, I might choose a double-blind study. You need to know that double-blind studies control for experimenter effects. So in a double-blind study, neither the participant nor the subject know whether or not they are in the experimental group. So I'd have 1,000 people in my study, and 500 are playing video games, but they're all getting a test of memory. And I simply wouldn't know who is who. I would have to enlist assistants to keep track. Oftentimes this is done with a numbering system where people get a number, and we track them by their number, and then we can tie that into their results. It's important to have the highest level of ethical integrity. So there have been lots of cases early on in psychology where ethics were not considered. In some respects, we didn't realize that we were breaking rules. Early psychologists were breaking rules that hadn't been written yet. So what you see here is a picture of Stanley Milgram in the famous or infamous authority research. He enlisted the help of a research participant. He said he called this person the teacher. He said that there was a teacher and a learner. The teacher was to stand on the other side or sit on the other side of a one-way mirror. The individual that you see here in the tie strapped to these wires was referred to as the learner. The teacher was to speak over a one-way mirror, over a microphone, and to call out certain words. And the learner was to recite these words in order. If he made a mistake, the teacher was to press a button to administer an electric shock. Milgram told the teacher that the study was designed to study the impact of memory on, impact of stress on memory. Now, the catch was that was not actually the true hypothesis or the true subject of the study. The purpose of the study was to measure or to study conformity. The question was this: if somebody was instructed to do something that they did not want to do, that they knew was not right, would they, if they were pressured by authority? The learner in the experiment was lied to. He was never given the opportunity to discontinue the research. As this study has been replicated, just so that you know, the learner in this study was not being shocked. In fact, the person we're studying really was the teacher. But this was at a time where these 7 ethical guidelines were never put in place. And it's really because of the Milgram study that these were written. So now if you participate in research, you're going to be informed of your rights as a participant, not just the value of the study. You have to give informed consent. If there's any deception, it needs to be clearly justified as essential and necessary for the purpose of the study and the well-being of participants. You have to be given the opportunity to withdraw or leave. You have to be protected from risks. There should be a debriefing, which Milgram never debriefed his participants. They were never told, hey, we were lying to you for the purposes of science, and data needs to be confidential. So all these things need to be at the forefront of our mind as we study psychological research and understand that it should be thoroughly ethical. Okay, this concludes Chapter 1, Part 2, and I look forward to hearing your response to some of our questions in the module, Chapter 1 module. Okay, take care, guys. Bye.